Hello and welcome to my video. What does the sinking of the Moskva mean for the Russian Navy, and how will it impact the invasion of Ukraine? Come join me for my video on the sinking of the Moskva and what it means for Russia's Black Sea Fleet, an analysis of Russia's naval forces in the Black Sea in the war for Ukraine. So before we get into strategy, combat maneuvers, and the real exciting stuff you came here for, I want to give you some context. Here is our best idea of the Russian order of battle as of February 24th, 2022. You will notice that of the dozen or so surface ships, half are amphibious assault ships. And of the 12 or so combat vessels, half are submarines, kilo classes at that. Uh, a ship that really doesn't belong in modern war. It was a second-rate submarine in the 1980s and really doesn't have a purpose today. If you ask me, the most valuable assets in the Russian order of battle are the naval infantry elements. All in all, it's a pretty weak force, all things considered. Listed here was the entirety of the Ukrainian Navy's combat assets as of February 24th, 2022. The Ukrainian Navy is all gone, sunk or scuttled. They had more before the invasion of Crimea, but after the Russians captured it, it got scrapped. I'd like to bring everybody up to speed on all the naval actions that have happened within the Black Sea up until now. In the early hours of the invasion, there were reports that the Russians had conducted amphibious operations to capture Odessa and Mykolaiv. These reports were false. What had actually happened was the Russian Navy had been conducting shore bombardment with missile cruisers. Later in the first day of the invasion, the Moskva and the Vasily Baikov captured Snake Island. You also saw Ukrainian forces scuttling their own vessels in the early hours of the invasion. Russian naval infantry were dropped off to link up with Russian ground forces coming from Crimea heading towards Mariupol. Russian ships also fired on civilian shipping. An Alligator-class amphibious warfare ship was set on fire and was blown up in port. The Ukrainians claim that they fired a cruise missile at it. However, we don't know what happened to it. It could have just as easily been partisans or poor maintenance that took down the ship. It's unclear whether or not other ships were damaged in port, but we do know that one was sunk or severely damaged. And now, most recently, the Moskva was sunk, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Understanding the Black Sea Fleet. So right now we will quickly go over why. We went over what the Black Sea Fleet is. Now we're going to quickly go over why. So during the Cold War, the Black Sea Fleet served to turn the Black Sea into a Soviet lake/buffer zone between the soft underbelly of the USSR and NATO. It got second-rate equipment because it was at the bottom of the priority lists. Other naval regions like the North Sea and the Far East got priority over it. So it's never been the best that the Soviets/Russians can field. This means that the Black Sea Fleet has always been quite anemic and defensive in nature. During the Cold War, it had a lot of World War II era ships that really hadn't been upgraded from their glory days during the Great Patriotic War. So continuing on our theme of why, we will talk about the role of Russia's naval forces during this war. They can be broken down into 4 categories/objectives. Neutralize Ukrainian naval vessels and installations. They've accomplished this, and they did it very early in the war. Set up a blockade of Ukraine to stop the export of Ukrainian goods and the import of NATO supplies. Thirdly, to support tactical and strategic operations that are going on in the ground war. They fired missiles into Ukraine in the early days, and some ships were helping in the siege of Mariupol. Finally, to assist in the landing of naval infantry. They landed some naval infantry near Mariupol, and for a while you actually had naval infantry loitering around Odessa. The Russians never made their objectives. They never made it to Odessa, so those guys never got deployed, or at least they haven't been deployed yet. Um, but they were there for a little while. All things considered, the naval war has probably been the most successful theater of the war for them. However, the Ukrainians never stood much of a chance in that regard, so it's kind of a wash. But fundamentally, Russia has achieved all of its objectives in the naval war. The sinking of the Muskva, Russian naval losses, and the future of naval power in this war. How Russia will use its in-theater naval power going forward. So going forward, here are some things to keep in mind. Russian losses are irreplaceable. The Turks will not allow any new Russian military assets to enter the Black Sea. Russian losses will mount, either from Ukrainian missile fire or due to poor maintenance. Russian losses are already substantial. They've already lost 1/6 of their entire surface fleet in the Black Sea, including their flagship. Because of all of these factors, the tempo of Russian naval activity may decrease. So we will now talk about the Moskva. I'm not going to read you out the entire Wikipedia article and fact sheet. I'm not that kind of YouTuber. I'm going to give you what you need to know. So the Moskva used to be called the Slava. It was the first of its class of Slava guided missile cruisers. She was designed in the 60s and 70s and laid down in 1976. She wasn't commissioned until '83, however, and after only just a few short years of service was retired in 1990. However, they did put her back in the service in 2000 after spending 10 years rusting on a beach somewhere. Its primary armaments are its 16 missile launchers strapped to its side. Now the reason for this comes down to Soviet doctrine and economics. The Soviets knew they couldn't match the West in terms of technology, carriers, planes, or number of hulls. So they derived a method to counter this in the form of anti-ship missile technology. In fact, anti-ship missile technology was one of the few instances where the Soviets eclipsed the West. Now the reason for this is that a missile is cheaper than a plane, and a missile cruiser is far cheaper than a carrier. However, this does come with trade-offs. The overall quality and flexibility of the fleet is quite poor when compared to its Western counterparts. However, for countering NATO forces in the North Atlantic, it's excellent, at least in theory. So the Ukrainian story about how they sunk the Moskva is actually quite interesting. For starters, they used domestically produced Neptune anti-ship missiles, not any kind of a foreign model, and allegedly they used a TB2 drone to distract the focus of the Moskva. They also would have used the storm to both conceal the placement of the anti-ship battery on shore and conceal/disguise the incoming radar signature as wave tops. The Russians claimed that the ship had been evacuated due to an internal fire and ammo explosion rather than sunk by Ukrainian missiles. They interestingly also claimed that the ship was being towed at the time. The Ukrainians have every reason to lie, but I do believe them here. It doesn't matter which side you believe, because the ship is gone. However, based on just this one incident, you can derive two completely different models of how the naval war will play out in the future. If Ukraine is right, Ukrainian anti-ship missiles are a threat. This means that Russia will be less willing to deploy their navy close to Ukrainian shores. And this means that any future naval support will be far less likely to happen and far less accurate and effective. This also means that any future landings of Russian troops will have to happen within occupied territory. Now, if Russia is correct, it doesn't necessarily mean that the situation is any better for them, because it means that Russian equipment is far worse than we thought. This means that due to poor maintenance, Russian warships won't be able to maintain their current operational tempo. i.e. they won't be able to be at sea for very long. This also means that any future naval operations will have to be planned around the maintenance schedule of Russian warships. The bottom line. This will massively affect Russia's capabilities within the Black Sea, either through the direct sinking of the Moskva or due to the changes that will come about from the sinking of the Moskva. Either way, this is a huge propaganda victory and morale boost for Ukraine. So how does this ultimately affect the war? In conclusion, it really doesn't. Russia has already achieved much of what it wants from the naval theater, and existing surface and submariner forces can already continue the blockade. The chances of the Russians having a contested landing anyways were minimal to begin with, so they don't need the extra firepower that the Moskva would provide in that scenario. And due to the very nature of Russian ships, their ground support capability was always limited. Truly, this is a symbolic victory for Ukraine. It doesn't meaningfully change the tactical or strategic picture in any meaningful way. I would like to stress one final conclusion. This is not Russia's first or final losses. They will lose more ships either through combat with Ukraine or from poor maintenance. Thank you for watching through to the end of my first presentation. I hope this video was as enlightening as it was enjoyable. I plan to make a lot more of these um, about general geopolitical subjects. This video was a little bit rough shot and rushed out, so I will have better production in the future. My next video will probably be about Russian losses, mostly focused on how sustainable they are. Anyways, thank you for watching my video. Goodbye, and have a nice day.